Welcome back to our journey of a lifetime. We'll be continuing with lesson 10, looking at the book of 2 Samuel today. But before we do, as we did with our classes that we do live, I'm going to begin with a map exercise. It's very important to learn some of the geography of the Holy Land. If you don't get anything else out of this map exercise, just get this. These are real places and real people. These are historical events and they're historical places. And as you learn to know, become more confident and competent inside of your Bible, then you'll start to see a lot of connections, because a lot of these places come up over and over again throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And not only that, the Middle East is still a part of our history today. And so a lot of these places still have the same names that they had back then. So we're going to do a quick jot of a simple map, and then next week in our classes, people are going to come back and have a test. So if you have your book with you, if you'll turn to page 46, you'll see that there's a map there that's titled The Kingdom of David. And I want you to flip over to the back of that page 46, and I want you to sketch this same map, which is going to be similar, but I have a few different things I want to add from that map that's on 46. And then we come back next time, we're going to have a map test. I'm going to give a blank piece of paper and let you see if you can sketch out this map. So here's what we're going to start with. First, we're going to just draw a little line, just like this. And that's going to be the shore, and here's the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so this is the sea, this is the land. Then we'll come over and draw our two things that makes it easy to identify the Holy Land. Just draw a small circle, draw a vertical line, then at the bottom draw an oblong circle. And of course this upper circle, if you'll remember our last map test, this is the Sea of Galilee. This of course is the Jordan River. And this, of course, is the Dead Sea. And so that gives us our bodies of water, which we had learned on our previous exam that we did. So now I want to look at, first, 3 mountains that are important, that just help us to get oriented. And then we're going to look at 4 different cities or towns. Okay, the first thing I want you to do is come here. You have the Dead Sea. Come to the north shore. We're going to go a little bit over to the east and just draw a triangle there. A triangle, and you can color that triangle in. That is Mount Nebo. Okay, and that's an important thing to remember. You remember as Moses was looking over into the Promised Land, the nation of Israel had come up this way, and he was allowed to stand on Mount Nebo and to look across the Jordan River into the Promised Land to see it, though he was not allowed to enter it. All right, now I want you to come over here and just come basically due west of the Sea of Galilee, just off that southern shore, kind of due west. And there's actually a little peninsula here in the land that'll help you. And then draw a triangle right here, another triangle. And that triangle is going to represent Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel is going to come up later and come to the story of Elijah. And then now we're going to come to our third mountain. Now to find our third mountain, you just have to draw a diagonal, and then right about the middle is a third mountain. Draw another triangle, and this mountain is called Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim pops up a few times in the Old and New Testament. Probably the most famous reference that people will be familiar with is when Jesus was speaking to the woman at the well, and she said, "We worship on this mountain, and you worship on the mountain in Jerusalem." She's referring to this Mount Gerizim, where still today the descendants of the Samaritans still do their worship on this Mount Gerizim even today. So that's the 3 mountains. Now let's add the 4 cities. All right, so 4 cities. The easiest one to start with, if you'll see the Jordan River, just to the north shore, a little bit over to the west, it's down in the Jordan Valley, is a city. That's the city that the Israelites came in, and Joshua led the people to defeat this city with big walls, right? You know that city. That is Jericho. All right, and then if you wind up the mountains and you come to another town just a little bit to the west, maybe a little bit south, you have a very important city. Now this is the city which was established under King David, and that is the city of Jerusalem. You can always find it. It's just to the west of the north shore of the Dead Sea. And now you can come down a little south and a little bit west. Another very important, not a very big city, but a very important town. It is the hometown of, you'll remember, Ruth and Boaz. And of course, they'll have their grandson named Jesse, and Jesse's sons, the most famous which is David. And then, of course, several hundred years later, you're going to see the birth of Jesus Christ. All that happens in this little town of Bethlehem. And then we have one more town. If you come up just to the north of Mount Gerizim, is the town of Samaria. Now, Samaria is important simply because later on in history, the nation is going to divide with the nation of Judah in the south, Israel in the north, and Samaria is going to become the capital of the northern city. And it's from this town or this city's name, which is the capital, that the northern Israelite tribes become known as Samaritans because their capital city was in Samaria. So there's our three mountains: Mount Nebo, Mount Gerizim, Mount Carmel, and our four cities: Jericho, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Samaria. So jot that down. When we come back next time, I'm going to bring out a blank piece of paper, and we're going to see if you can jot that down. Okay, now let's look at the beginning of Lesson 10, top of page 42. We'll be looking at the book of 2 Samuel. As it says there in that first paragraph, the book of 2 Samuel deals almost completely with the story of David as king. It does not tell the whole story, for David's reign continues into 1 Kings, which is just the very, very last days, really, of his rule as king. And you remember in 1 Samuel covers the early life of David, but it also covers the birth and life of Samuel. Then it goes and transitions in the time of the kings, which is the first king, which is Saul, and then King Saul. At the end of 1 Samuel, in the final chapter, we see the death of King Saul, and that begins the transition, of course, from the family of Saul leading the nation to the family of David. Now, in the opening chapter, as you'll see there of 2 Samuel, there's an Amalekite who comes, and he gives a different account of the death of Saul than that found in 1 Samuel 31. Now I'm going to turn to 1 Samuel 31 and just give a quick overview of what it says so we can compare the stories and see if we can do a little bit of detective work and figure out why the stories have some discrepancies. Now the 1 Samuel chapter 31. The entire chapter is about the final battle of the Philistines as they were fighting. And then we see in chapter 31, verse 3, it says, the battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him. So the Philistine archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then the Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. And when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all of his men on that day. Now, in the meantime, or about this same time while Saul was fighting this battle, we know from the previous chapter that David had been fighting against people called the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites had always, kind of like the Philistines, been a thorn in the side of Israel. They had opposed them as they were initially trying to enter into the Promised Land. They were battling against them a lot. As a matter of fact, it got to the point where God told Saul to go and destroy them. When you look back in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, I believe it's chapter 15, it's part of Saul's disobedience. This is what God told Saul God told Saul in verse 3. We'll just read verse 3. It says, now go, this is God talking to Saul, and strike Amalek, that's the leader, the king of the Amalekites, and utterly destroy all that he has. Do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So here we see this picture that we've seen many times now as they're coming and entering the land. It's this type of judgment, similar to the type of judgment we saw in the time of Noah, when the sin has become so widespread with violence and immorality that God in his justice wipes out the entire people. That's what he tells Saul he wants to do. So Saul summoned his army. They went, they defeated him. And he has happened with, even in the time of Joshua, they did about 90% of the job. But in verse 9 it says, But Saul and the people spared Agag. That was the king of the Amalekites. And they also kept the best of the sheep and of the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good. And they were not willing to destroy all the people utterly. But everything that they despised and found worthless, that they utterly destroyed. So we see that even though God had given them this command to go and destroy the Amalekites, they didn't do it. And instead, it says they only destroyed the things that they found detestable and didn't necessarily do what the Lord told them. And then, so the Amalekites continued to cause problems. And we see later on and towards the end of 1 Samuel that the Amalekites invade the town that David has been living in while David and his men are out. They come and invade the town. They steal all of their wives and children and ransack the city. And then in verse 30 of 1 Samuel, you see that David comes and has victory over these Amalekites. And he goes and takes back everything. Now, the reason I give you this whole history of the Amalekites is because when we come to the first chapter of 2 Samuel, there's going to be an Amalekite show up that's going to give a different story of what happened to Saul. We're going to see why he did that. So now let's look in the first chapter of 2 Saul, where there's a man who comes up. I'm going to read in verse 5. It says, So David said to the young man, a young man came up to him and said, this is verse 4. He said that many people have fallen and are dead. So this young man comes up to David and he tells him, many people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. So David said to the man who told him, How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? You remember we read the actual account, but here's what the young man tells him. The young man who told him said, By chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and horsemen were pursuing him closely. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I said, Here I am. And Saul said to me, Who are you? And I answered him. Now what did he say? I am an Amalekite, the same people that's caused all the problems. Then he, that is Saul, said to me, which is the Amalekite man, Please stand beside me and kill me, for the agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in him. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he would not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. It says, Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the other men. And then we read down in 2 Samuel verses 15 and 16. Of course, David knew the story didn't add up, and he also said, How is it that you were not afraid to destroy the Lord's anointed, the king? And so he looked at this Amalekite, and this Amalekite apparently was thinking, hey, David's been fighting against my people. My people have come and ransacked his all of his things and kidnapped his wife, and he's recovered them. But hopefully I can find mercy if I come and tell this story. So the Amalekite tells him this story, and instead David says, How were you not afraid of God that you would kill God's anointed king? And so he has this Amalekite executed because he's killed the anointed king of God. And then we see in the last part of the first chapter of 2 Samuel this beautiful song. We see, we often talk about David having a heart after God, and here I think we see where that comes from. Here, you remember David was a teenager when he was anointed to be the next king. And we're going to see later on, it wasn't until he was 30 that he became king. And in most of those interim years, he's had to being chased for his life by King Saul, been mistreated, been abused, been lied about. And yet, even after all that, you can see through this song at the first chapter of 2 Samuel that David forgives Saul for all the things that he's done and writes this wonderful song which honors Saul. And we see the heart, though, in that comment to Amalekite. The reason he honored Saul was not for Saul's sake, but for God's sake. David always saw Saul as God's anointed. And then we come to the second chapter, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So if you look there at the middle of page 42, you can see the outline of the book. And you'll notice in chapters 2 through 10, we see sort of the rise of David, which we're going to look at how he expanded the kingdom and so forth. And that only goes on for 9 chapters, 2 through 10. So David's rise doesn't take very long. And then the rest of the book from chapter 11 all the way through the end, 11 through 24, which is over half the book, is actually about David's sin, his moral collapse, and all the devastating consequences that happened to him through this. So in chapter 2, David asked the Lord, what should I do? Should I go and set up in one of these cities of Judah? And God tells him to go to the place of Hebron. Now, if you'll turn over to your map on page 46, we didn't put it on our map here. We can add it here, but Hebron was just to the south of Bethlehem, so it was right in here. A place called Hebron. So he went there, and in Hebron, he was anointed king, but just of his tribe, the tribe of Judah. It says the men of Judah came and anointed him king of the house of Judah. And then we see a lot of infighting, and it goes on actually for quite a while and is very violent. But in the end, we see on the top of 43 that David did win the hearts of all of Israel because of his abilities and his great spirit. And as I mentioned earlier, the thing you have to remember about David is he was patiently waiting for over 10 years, maybe 15 years, from the time he was anointed by Samuel until the time that he actually became the king. And then he was anointed king finally over all the tribes of Israel. And then because he wanted to find a peaceable way that they could dwell together, he decided that they would conquer the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was one of the towns. It was controlled by the Jebusites. And they had a huge wall because it was on a mountain. And it was difficult for them to conquer. And so he decided he would do this. He would capture this town of Jerusalem and set it up as a capital of Israel. This is very important to notice if you look again at your map. Jerusalem is essentially on the border between Judah and Israel. So it was a place that didn't have history, that neither tribe was in, or none of the tribes, I should say, were attached to. And it also became a peaceful place. A new city was founded, kind of like this when they made Washington, D.C., which was this new city in America that didn't have any history, to help unite all of the colonies in the same sort of way. He chose this Jerusalem, this new place. And if you read the story, it's a pretty fascinating story because the Jebusites had built this big wall, this big city, that they ridiculed and said David would never be able to take it. And just a historical note, I encourage you to go, if you watch any of the documentaries, it used to be thought that these were all just myths until just half a century or so ago. And now you can actually go, because the way that go and see the evidence of how David conquered the city. The story is told in the Bible that had a huge wall. You couldn't go penetrate the wall. And so, but there was a tunnel that had been dug to a spring. And how David conquered the city is he and his men snuck up through this tunnel which had been dug to go down to the spring, through which they were able to bring water to the city. And that, of course, was thought to be a myth until some years back. Guess what they discovered under the city? They have, and you can actually go see pictures of it and videos of the actual tunnel that used to lead down to the spring, which was eventually, of course, it was enlarged in the time when Jerusalem became a larger city. But the point is this: David becomes king, united over all the tribes. He sets up, the first time we see Jerusalem here is established as the capital of all of the tribes of the nation of Israel. And then he did something you'll see in the middle of page 43, that after it was established, he brought the Ark of the Covenant from that village, Kiriath Jearim. You remember he had been there since the Philistines had put it on that cart and sent it back into, or the cows, I should say, carried it back into Israel. It had been sitting there, so he brought it into Jerusalem. And of course, they had a big celebration. And it says there, after the Ark was in Jerusalem, David became troubled because it still was housed in a tent. So he called Nathan, a prophet, and told him his feelings. And at first Nathan declared that the Lord would support David in the building of a temple, and that he should proceed with his plans. But then David had a message from God to tell David that his son would build the temple. And then we see, however, David is told that he will be compensated for his faithfulness. And he's given a promise. And I'm going to read that promise in chapter 17, verses 14 and 15. It says this. This is God speaking to David. He says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me when he commits iniquity. I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house, speaking of David, and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So that we see is the promise that God gives to David. And then if you look at the next question there, it asks how this promise was fulfilled. Because, of course, the kingdom's going to collapse and Jerusalem will eventually be rebuilt. And after its final collapse in 70 A.D., we're going to see that it seems like it's done for. But we know that promise has been and will be fulfilled. And we have it mentioned here in Luke 1, verses 32 through 33. And that's when Gabriel, the angel, comes and talks to Mary. And he tells her about the son that she is going to have by God. It says in verse 32 that he will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So we see there in the New Testament that Jesus fulfills this prophecy which was given to David. Jesus, of course, is a descendant of David, and Jesus was going to set up not an earthly kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom that would last forever. And so it's no coincidence that after Jesus set up his spiritual kingdom, which was not of this earth, he said, then just shortly thereafter, the entire tabernacle, the city of Jerusalem, was destroyed. It is rebuilt today, but that temple has never been rebuilt until this very day. So bottom of page 43. And it talks a little about it. Chapter 8 gives some records of things that happen. And if we look on page 46, your map, we're going to see a number of the places that David conquered. Oh, and I forgot to give you the answer to that last one. Here's the suggested answer at the bottom of page 43, that when Christ returns, he shall reign on the throne of David forever. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the kingdom of David and enemies that were conquered by David. Now you can look on your map on page 46, and all of the areas that have the squiggly lines that are kind of grayed out with the crosshatch, those are areas that were conquered under the time of David. And you can see there, if you look at the upper right-hand side, you'll see Syria, which, by the way, Syria, which is up here, that is still Syria to this day. Matter of fact, the town of Damascus that's mentioned is still a modern-day city as well. And then you can see across to the west, which will be over here, this area of Phoenicia. They're going to sign a treaty, become actually very good trade partners with the king of Phoenicia. And then we also see the land of Philistia, which is to the south, is down here. And Philistia, as we talked about last week, is the home of the Philistines, which were some of the sea peoples, which, by the way, the Phoenicians and the Philistines were sea peoples who had migrated over from the Aegean Sea. And then we also see the city of Ammon, which is here east of the Jordan River. And then what are the other ones we have listed here? Moab to the south, and Edom to the further south. And you remember that Edom was the land of the descendants of Esau, which was, of course, Jacob's twin brother. And Moab, we remember Moab because David's great-grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabitess who had moved and eventually lived into Bethlehem. But at any rate, these are all the countries that were conquered. And you can see there, it asks the question about what percentage is the land base would you estimate that David how much did he increase Israel's territory? And you can see about 100%. So the land area that was controlled by the nation of Israel after they united doubled in the lifetime of David. Now I'm going to put a map up here, and this is from our Holman Bible Atlas, and we can see this kind of in detail. The purple area, as you see here, and this is represented just in white in the map in your books, the purple area is what was controlled under the time of Saul, and then the green territories are the ones that when David came into power, they fought all these battles, and all these arrows, by the way, on this map just outlines the different battles that he fought. And then, of course, the red area up here in Phoenicia, they conquered it, but they were really more allies with Phoenicia. They didn't really rule them. And then the Philistines were always a problem because they were coming and going by sea, but they did establish control of that. So you can see under the time of David, he greatly, greatly increased the amount of territory of the country. So that all happens by chapter 10. And at the end of chapter 10, things are going very well. And then we come to chapter 11. I'm going to read the first few verses of chapter 11 as we see this change in tone. It says, "Then it happened in the springtime when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah." So the idea is Rabbah is the last city. David's conquered all this territory, and so now he's going to fight. Here's Rabbah, and they're in this final area here, the last battle really they could do to consolidate all of their gains. But David, though he should have been with his troops and his generals, we see that he didn't, that he stayed back home. And then it says, as he was home, all the other men were out fighting where he should have been, but he stayed back. And verse 2 says, he arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful in appearance. And then, of course, that woman's name is Bathsheba. He sent for that woman to find out who it was. They said it's Bathsheba. She's the wife. She's married, wife of one of your brave soldiers named Uriah, who was a Hittite who apparently had converted to Judaism and lived there in the city. And so Joseph, consumed by passion, asked her to come, and he had relations with her. And then sent her home and thought, well, that must be it. But it wasn't it, because then Bathsheba, as we see, became pregnant from this affair, and then she sent word back to David that she was pregnant. Now, this was a problem because her husband hadn't been home at all. And, of course, the servants and everyone, I'm sure, saw her come and go, or at least some of them did. So David concocts a plan to cover up his sin. So he sends word to the battlefront back up here at Rabbah. So they're in Jerusalem, sent word over to Rabbah and had them send Uriah back. So Joab, the general, sent Uriah back, and David got a report from him, and acted like, well, I just have you here to give me a report, tell me what's going on. I heard you did a great job, so forth. And he said, so what I want you to do is I want you to go home, spend a couple nights at home, get some R&R, relax, go see your wife, right? And in hopes that he would go see his wife, and then when the baby was born, no one would know it was his. But Uriah didn't. He said he would not go home. Why did Uriah not go home, according to chapter 11, verse 11? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths or in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as my soul lives, I will not do this thing. And so David tried, and then he would try again later to get him to go, but was unsuccessful. And so then we see this is all a tragedy, but this is even more tragic. To cover up, David wrote a letter of instructions, battlefield instructions for Joab. And in those instructions, he told Joab, I want you to go and push close to the city, and then put Uriah on the front lines. And then once they come under attack, have everyone pull back and leave Uriah out there by himself. so that he would be killed. And then in the most tragic way, guess who delivered their own death warrant? So Uriah unknowingly took this letter from the king, not knowing that that very letter that he would deliver had the instructions for how he would be deserted and be killed, how his murder was plotted. As we see at the bottom of, and I'll give you that answer as well, that David sent a letter to Joab telling him to send Uriah to the front lines so he would be killed. So David's sin of adultery, the lies, the cover-up, the eventual murder would haunt him for the rest of his life. And we saw that when we read God's promise to David, that he would see his iniquity and would discipline him, but he would never desert him. And we'll see the harvest in the rest of the book in his own family and the entire nation of Israel, that he will indeed reap what he's sown. Top of page 45. So David was confronted by his sin by the prophet Nathan. And you remember Nathan came up and told the story about a man who had a sheep, and he was a poor man, just had one sheep, and he treated it like it was one of his family. And there was a rich man who was next door that had lots of sheep. And the rich man had some guests that came over. And so he said this rich man, instead of using one of his own sheep, went to the poor man and took this lamb that he loved like a child and took it and sacrificed this other man's lamb to serve his guests and left the other man without anything. And David became enraged. And of course, the turn of the story there in chapter 12, Nathan says, "You are this man, this rich man." And so, of course, that conviction came over, and we actually read in the Psalms of how sad and overcome David was for his sin. And these are some of the consequences, top of page 45, that we're going to see. Here's the first consequence we see that came out of this tragedy, this series of tragedies and sins. We see that the child who Uriah's wife, that is Bathsheba, bore to David, dies on the seventh day. So you remember the picture. David lays out prostrate and fasts and prays, and then that baby passes away. And then David says that famous verse that, again, even in the midst of this suffering and these consequences, and they said, "Are you not going to mourn now that your baby son has died?" And he says, "He cannot return to me, but I can go to him." So we see that David already has this idea of heaven, that this baby was in heaven and that one day he would see him again. The next thing you see, top of page 45, is that Amnon, that's one of David's oldest sons, rapes his sister Tamar. Falls in love. And you know, the saddest part of this story, it says that Amnon came, he fell in love with his sister, his half-sister, and because she was beautiful, and he was consumed with lust and passion for her. And finally he took her, and the moment he was finished, it said that he hated her with more passion than he had ever loved her. And instead of taking her as a wife, he kicked her out and shamed his half-sister Tamar. And then we see, as you see, point 3, the story continues. The dysfunction continues. Absalom, who is the brother of Tamar, sets up Amnon and kills him for raping and shaming his sister Tamar. You see, the story goes on in number 5. We see that finally Absalom leads a rebellion against David, which is successful in the beginning. And David doesn't want to fight his own son Absalom, and so he flees Jerusalem. But eventually his generals and everything, they get reorganized. They come and they conquer Absalom. And then the final sad part of this story is that now also Absalom was killed in the battle. And you can see the picture there on page 45 is a depiction of that famous story where Absalom was famous for his long hair. And as he was running away from the incoming troops, he went under a tree, a big oak tree, and his hair got entangled in the limb, and his horse ran out from under him, and so he was dangling there. And while he was dangling there, some of the soldiers of David ran him through. And then we see David's reaction to the death of his son Absalom. It says that he wept and wished that that is David, wept and wished that David had died instead of his son Absalom. And then we come to the closing days of David in the last few chapters. After this rebellion, David consolidated his rule over Israel. In a lot of ways, this is seen as the heyday of the Jewish kingdom, or I should say the entire Israelite kingdom at that time. And David was not allowed to build the temple because he had blood on his hands, and his son Solomon, we'll see, will build the temple. But David went ahead and prepared everything, made all the negotiations with the king of Phoenicia to bring in the woods and send the people who would do the woodwork. He collected the stone and made preparations, and he even bought the property, the threshing floor, from a man named Araunah. And in that famous passage, which I'm going to read, Araunah says, "Hey, you can just have this land, king. You know, if it's for the Lord, you take it. I don't want to sell it to you. You just take it for free. I'll give it as an offering, as a gift for the temple of God." And this is what David's reply. The king replied to Araunah, "No, I will buy it from you with a price. I will not offer offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." So David brought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And of course, as we'll see on that very spot, that threshing floor, that it was bought, the temple would be built there by his son Solomon. And so you see there at the end of 1 Kings, it records the death of King David. He died at the age of 70, so he served as king from the age 30 to 70. And to this day, he's remembered as a hero of the Israelite nation, because he took a nation that was in chaos and organized it and united it into the map and the place that we saw, and took it to heights. And his son Solomon will inherit this kingdom, which is in peace. Now, there's no more fighting. He's to take this peaceful kingdom and grow its influence even more. But we'll see that in the next lesson. Thank you.